What drives a soldier, trained to protect, to commit acts so dark they demand the final punishment? Tonight, we unravel the stories of US military men who are set to face execution, their crimes, their trials, and what led to this moment. What did they do to end up on death row? Let's find out. But first, drop a comment telling us where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. First, we traveled to North Carolina near Fort Bragg in the year 1986. Ronald Gray, a 21-year-old Army private, lived a double life. To his fellow soldiers, he was just another young man serving his country, stationed at one of the largest military bases in the United States. But beneath the surface, a predator was emerging, driven by a compulsion to dominate and destroy. Between December 1986 and January 1987, Gray's actions would leave a trail of devastation, claiming the lives of at least 4 women and shattering the sense of safety in a community tied to the military. His victims were young, vibrant women, each with dreams and futures that Gray would brutally extinguish. Who were these women? And what did Gray do to end up on death row? Kimberly Ann Ruggles was a 23-year-old taxi driver, working late nights to make ends meet. She was known for her warm smile and determination, saving up to build a better life. On December 15, 1986, she picked up a fare near Fort Bragg, a soldier who seemed unassuming. That soldier was Ronald Gray. Instead of a routine ride, Gray directed her to a secluded area, where he attacked with chilling precision. He raped and stabbed her multiple times, leaving her body in a wooded area near the base. The brutality was staggering. Her body bore the marks of a frenzied assault, her life stolen in a matter of minutes. But this was only the beginning. Weeks later, on January 3, 1987, 25-year-old Army Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay was found dead in her off-base apartment. Laura was a dedicated soldier, proud to serve, and known for her loyalty to her comrades. Gray, however, saw her as a target. He broke into her home, raped her, and stabbed her repeatedly, leaving her to bleed out on her own floor. Just days later, on January 6, 1987, 18-year-old Tammy Wilson, a high school student with dreams of becoming a nurse, crossed Gray's path. She was abducted, raped and murdered, her body discarded like refuse in a remote area. Another victim, Mary Ann Lang, a civilian, was also linked to Gray's spree. Her life ended in a similar act of calculated violence. The community reeled. How could a soldier, trained to protect, become a monster? The investigation began when Kimberly Ruggles' body was discovered by a jogger in the woods near Fort Bragg. Police were initially baffled. The crime scene was chaotic, with bloodstains and signs of a struggle but little else to go on. However, a breakthrough came when detectives found a partial fingerprint on Ruggles' taxi, later matched to Ronald Gray through military records. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern. Witnesses reported seeing a soldier matching Gray's description near the crime scenes. Fibers from his clothing were found on Vickery Clay's body, and a knife in his possession bore traces of blood that would later be tied to Tammy Wilson through early DNA analysis. Gray's prior criminal history, a string of lesser offenses like theft and assault, hinted at his escalating behavior, but no one foresaw the extent of his depravity. When questioned, Gray initially denied involvement, but the evidence was overwhelming. A confession followed, chilling in its matter-of-fact detail, as he described his crimes with no remorse. The trial, held in a military court-martial in 1988, was a spectacle of horror and justice. Prosecutors painted Gray as a calculated predator, presenting forensic evidence, fingerprints, DNA, and the murder weapon that left no doubt of his guilt. The defense argued Gray suffered from psychological issues, possibly tied to his military service, but the jury didn't believe his story. After a unanimous verdict, Gray was convicted of multiple counts of murder, rape, and robbery. The panel of 12 military members, all outranking Gray as required by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, sentenced him to death. Appeals followed, including a stay of execution granted in November 1988 by U.S. District Judge Richard Rogers, citing concerns over procedural errors. But in December 2016, Judge J. Thomas Martin lifted the stay, clearing the path for Gray's execution. His case has since lingered in federal appeals, with Gray, now 60 years old, still awaiting the president's final approval for execution, a requirement unique to military death sentences. Should Gray's execution proceed, it will take place at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, or possibly the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. The method would likely be lethal injection, the standard for federal and military executions since the 1980s. The process is clinical yet harrowing. Gray would be strapped to a gurney, his arms secured with leather restraints. 2 IV lines would be inserted, one as a backup. A cocktail of drugs, typically a sedative like sodium thiopental, followed by pancuronium bromide to paralyze the body, and potassium chloride to stop the heart, would be administered. Witnesses, including family members of the victims, would watch through a glass window as the drugs take effect, rendering Gray unconscious within seconds, his breathing stopping soon after. At an appointed time, perhaps 6:08 p.m., the process would begin, and within minutes, Gray's life would end. Gray's final meal. A shocking request has not been recorded, but military protocol allows inmates to choose their last meal within reason. His final words, if he chooses to speak, will be heard by a small audience of officials and witnesses. In past statements, Gray has expressed no remorse, a silence that weighs heavily on the families of Kimberly Ruggles, Laura Vickery Clay, Tammy Wilson, and Mary Ann Lang. Their lives full of promise, cut short by a soldier's betrayal, remain the heart of this tragedy. As the clock ticks in Fort Leavenworth, the question lingers: when will justice finally be served? Next, in the early hours of March 23, 2003, Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait was a hive of preparation. The U.S. invasion of Iraq had just begun, and the 101st Airborne Division was gearing up for the fight. Among them was 31-year-old Sergeant Hasan Akbar, a soldier with a troubled past and a growing resentment. Born Mark Fidel Cools, Akbar had converted to Islam in his youth, but his faith became a point of tension with some fellow soldiers. Behind his quiet demeanor burned a rage, one he documented in a journal entry on February 4, 2003. As soon as I am in Iraq, I am going to try and kill as many of them as possible. What would push a man to such a breaking point? In the dead of night, as his unit slept in their tents, Akbar struck. He stole fragmentation and incendiary grenades, then crept through the camp, lobbing them into 3 tents housing officers. The explosions tore through the night, waking soldiers to chaos and fire. As men stumbled out, wounded and disoriented, Akbar opened fire with his M4 rifle. Army Captain Christopher Seifert, 27, a husband and father known for his leadership and compassion, was shot in the back and died almost instantly. Air Force Major Gregory L. Stone, 40, a dedicated officer with a quick wit, succumbed to shrapnel wounds from the grenades. 14 other service members were injured, some severely. The attack was over in minutes, but the betrayal would echo for years. Who was Hasan Akbar, and how did he slip through the cracks to commit such an act? The investigation was swift and damning. Soldiers at the scene identified Akbar as the attacker, and he was apprehended almost immediately, still in possession of his rifle and grenade pins. His journal, recovered from his belongings, laid bare his premeditated intent, detailing his hatred for the military and his plan to kill his comrades. Forensic evidence sealed his fate. Ballistics matched his rifle to the bullets that killed Seifert, and shrapnel patterns linked the grenades to the carnage in the tents. Akbar's prior behavior, disciplinary issues and complaints about harassment over his Muslim faith, painted a picture of a soldier unraveling, yet no one had predicted the scale of his violence. The evidence was overwhelming, but would Akbar's defense reveal a hidden truth about his state of mind? At his court-martial in April 2005 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Akbar represented himself, a decision that raised eyebrows. Prosecutors presented an airtight case. The journal, the forensic evidence, and eyewitness accounts left no room for doubt. The defense argued Akbar suffered from mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, exacerbated by alleged harassment over his faith. But the jury didn't believe his story. After a swift deliberation, the 12-member panel, all outranking Akbar as required by military law, unanimously convicted him of 2 counts of premeditated murder and 14 counts of attempted murder. On April 28, 2005, they sentenced him to death. Appeals followed, with Akbar's attorneys claiming his mental health was inadequately assessed and that his self-representation was a procedural error. As of 2025, his case remains under review by the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, with a hearing held in March 2023, raising questions about his competency. Has Akbar's fate been sealed, or will a legal twist spare him from the gurney? If Akbar's execution is approved by the President, it will likely occur at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. Lethal injection would be the method, a process as precise as it is grim. Akbar would be restrained on a padded table, his arms extended for IV lines. A single drug, pentobarbital, would flow through the tubes, designed to render him unconscious before stopping his heart. At 6:08 p.m., or perhaps later, the process would begin, witnessed by military officials and possibly families of the victims. His final meal. No record exists of his request, but military protocol allows a choice within limits. Akbar's last words, if he chooses to speak, will carry the weight of his actions, actions that cost Christopher Seifert and Gregory Stone their lives. As the clock ticks, one question lingers: will Akbar's execution mark the military's first in over 6 decades? Stay tuned, because the answer may lie in the courts. Next we move to North Carolina. In May 1985, the sun sets over a modest home where Catherine Eastburn, 31, and her 2 daughters, Cara, 5, and Erin, 3, were living while their husband and father, Air Force Captain Gary Eastburn, was away at training. Catherine was a devoted mother, known for her kindness and strength, raising her girls with love in a close-knit military community. But on May 9, 1985, their home became a house of horrors. Timothy Hennis, a 27-year-old Army Master Sergeant stationed at Fort Bragg, would be linked to a crime so brutal it would haunt the nation. What did Hennis do that night, and how did he evade justice for so long? Catherine had placed an ad to rehome the family's dog, and Hennis responded, visiting their home days before the murders. On that fateful night, he returned, but his intentions were far darker. He raped Catherine, then stabbed her and her daughters multiple times, leaving their bodies in the home. Only the Eastburns' 22-month-old daughter, Jana, was spared, found crying in her crib days later. The crime scene was gruesome. Blood stained the floors and signs of a struggle marked the walls. Catherine fought for her life and her children's, but Hennis's attack was relentless. The community was shattered. How could a decorated soldier commit such an atrocity? The investigation initially pointed elsewhere. A neighbor reported seeing a man resembling Hennis leaving the Eastburn home, but early leads fizzled. Hennis was questioned after a witness linked him to the dog ad, and he provided a weak alibi. In 1986, he was tried in civilian court, convicted, and sentenced to death. But the evidence told a different story, or so his defense claimed. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned his conviction, citing unreliable eyewitness testimony. At a retrial in 1989, Hennis was acquitted, walking free to resume his military career. He retired as a master sergeant, seemingly untouchable. But could justice be denied forever? In 2006, a cold case detective in Cumberland County re-examined the case. DNA testing, unavailable in the 1980s, revealed a matched semen from Catherine's rape kit pointed directly to Hennis. The Army recalled him from retirement for a court-martial at Fort Bragg in 2010, as double jeopardy prevented a civilian retrial. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, combined with the original witness testimony, left no doubt. Hennis, now 52, was convicted of 3 counts of premeditated murder and sentenced to death on April 15, 2010. Appeals have argued procedural errors and questioned the DNA's handling, but as of 2025, Hennis remains on death row, his fate pending presidential approval. Did Hennis believe he'd outrun his past, only to be caught by science? Should Hennis face execution, it will mirror Akbar's lethal injection at Terre Haute, with pentobarbital administered under strict protocol. Strapped to the gurney, Hennis would face a small audience of witnesses, including possibly Gary Eastburn, who lost his entire family. His final meal remains unrecorded, but his last words, if any, will echo in the silence of the execution chamber. At 6:08 p.m., the needle would pierce his vein, and justice would take its course, or would it? The military hasn't executed anyone since 1961, and Hennis's appeals are far from over. Can the families of Catherine, Cara, and Aaron Eastburn find closure, or will the courts deliver one final twist? Now we turn to the final name, Nidal Hasan, an army major whose actions would mark one of the deadliest attacks on a U.S. military base. What could drive a psychiatrist, trained to heal minds, to unleash such carnage? And will justice ever catch up with him? Nidal Hasan, a 39-year-old army psychiatrist, was a complex figure at Fort Hood. Born in Virginia to Palestinian immigrant parents, he had risen through the ranks, earning a medical degree and specializing in mental health. To his colleagues, he was reserved, professional, but beneath the surface, Hasan was unraveling. Disillusioned with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, he had grown vocal about his opposition, citing his Muslim faith. In emails later uncovered by the FBI, he corresponded with Anwar al-Awlaki, a radical cleric linked to al-Qaeda, expressing sympathy for extremist views. On that fateful morning, Hasan entered the Soldier Readiness Center, a hub where soldiers underwent medical checks before deployment. He carried a semi-automatic FN-57 handgun, loaded with high-capacity magazines. What was he planning as he stepped into that crowded room? At approximately 1:34 p.m., Hasan shouted Allahu Akbar, Arabic for God is great, and opened fire. The scene erupted into chaos. Soldiers and civilians dove for cover, as bullets tore through the air, striking without mercy. For 10 minutes, Hasan moved methodically, targeting those in uniform, his weapons rapid fire cutting down anyone in his path. 13 lives were lost, 11 soldiers, 1 civilian employee, and an unborn child. Among them was 29-year-old Staff Sergeant Justin DeCrow, a husband and father known for his infectious optimism, shot multiple times as he tried to shield others. Private First Class Aaron Nemelka, just 19, had enlisted to serve his country, only to be gunned down before his first deployment. Civilian physician's assistant Michael Cahill, 62, charged at Hasan with a chair, attempting to stop the massacre, and paid with his life. 30 others were wounded, some left with permanent disabilities. Blood pooled on the floor, papers scattered, and screams filled the air, as Hasan's rampage turned a place of purpose into a battlefield. How could a healer become a harbinger of death? The investigation unfolded with chilling clarity. Fort Hood's Army Civilian Police responded within minutes, engaging Hasan in a gunfight outside the center. Sergeant Kimberly Munley and Senior Sergeant Mark Todd shot Hasan, paralyzing him from the waist down. Recovered evidence was damning. The FN-57, purchased legally months earlier, was traced to Hasan, with spent casings matching his weapon. His apartment yielded additional magazines, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and a laser sight, pointing to premeditation. The FBI's discovery of his emails to al-Awlaki revealed a motive rooted in ideological extremism, with Hasan admitting he aimed to prevent soldiers from deploying to fight Muslims abroad. His prior behavior, lectures to colleagues about jihad and warnings from superiors about his radical views, showed a man on a collision course with violence. The evidence was overwhelming, but would Hasan's defense unravel a different story? At his court-martial in August 2013, at Fort Hood, Hasan chose to represent himself. deliberated for less than 2 hours before convicting him of 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted murder. On August 28, 2013, they sentenced him to death, a unanimous verdict required by military law. Appeals have been limited, as Hasan has declined most opportunities to challenge his sentence, but as of 2025, his execution awaits presidential approval, a mandatory step for military death sentences. Families mourned Staff Sergeant Justin DeCrow, whose daughter grew up without her father's laughter. Aaron Nemelka's parents buried their youngest son, his dreams of service unfulfilled. Michael Cahill's bravery lives on in stories told by survivors. As Nidal Hasan sits in his cell at Fort Leavenworth, the question looms: will his execution bring closure, or will it fuel the very ideology he sought to advance? The military hasn't carried out an execution since 1961, and Hasan's fate hangs in the balance of a system slow to act. The military's swift justice aimed to restore order, but did it truly mend the broken bonds of trust? What are your thoughts on each of these cases? Share them in the comments, as I would be reading all of it. See you in the next video.